Welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and if this is your first time tuning in, thank you so much. We appreciate you, and we're so glad to have you here. And if you have been listening from the beginning, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today we've got a pretty great episode for you, but first make sure you are liking and subscribing to the podcast and make sure you turn on your notifications so you get notified anytime a new episode is released. I am better on track now. I know for a little bit I was off track and I'll stop mentioning it after this episode, I promise, but just make sure you turn on those notifications and share this with the ones you love because everyone loves a good creepy story every once in a while, right? So just be sure you're sharing. And if you want to recommend anyone, if you want to hear about anyone, please either, comment on this episode or message me on Instagram or Facebook. I've got both of those. Just let me know who you want to hear about because I want to talk about who you want to hear about. And speaking of which, today is actually a listener request, and I want to thank B. Huge shout out to B for the recommendation of today's episode. Today, we are going to be focusing on one of the most disturbing figures of the 20th century in all of history, of the 20th century, to be clear. He is a man whose name is not well known at all. I don't think I've heard of this man. And I've studied World War II pretty thoroughly, but he is less well known, but his crimes are pretty famous. And his legacy touches tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of victims. So today we are going to be talking about Shiro Ishii. He's a doctor, a microbiologist, a military officer, and the architect of Unit 731, the Japanese biological warfare program responsible for unimaginable torture and death during World War II. Now, if you have never heard of Unit 731, this is specifically what B had recommended. It's a secret Japanese biological warfare program that operated during the 1930s and 40s. It was a place where human beings, men, women, and children, were experimented on in ways that defy comprehension. We're going to get into the details of that. It was a place of torture and routine quote-unquote research and mass murder. So, buckle up. Take a deep breath because this story is pretty heavy, and once we enter this world, there is no going back because you can't unhear this story. So let's dive in to the story of Shiro Ishii. To understand how someone like Ishii emerged, we need to take a deeper look at where he came from. Shiro Ishii was born on June 25th, 1892, in Chiyoda Village in Japan's Chiba Prefecture. Now, this was a time of big transformation in Japan. It was just a couple decades after the Meiji Restoration, which, if you don't know what that is, which I didn't, don't worry, I'll tell you what it is. It was a political event that actually restored imperial rule in Japan, and that happened in 1868 under Emperor Meiji. Hence the Meiji Restoration. So he became the emperor. And it was also a time when the nation was rapidly modernizing and militarizing. So This is kind of a crazy time in Japan's history because they were very eager to prove themselves on a global stage, and they were also fascinated with science and deeply obsessed with power, hence the wanting to prove themselves on a global stage. Now, Ishii was born into a very wealthy family. They owned land, and his father was a local village leader, very well respected and super influential in the area. The Ishii household valued education, discipline, and national pride, which was very common in Japan. National pride was like the most important thing in that culture at the time. So Shiro grew up with privilege. He had access to the best schools, he had financial stability, and a family that encouraged ambition, which is very opposite of what we typically hear about the people on this podcast. He grew up in a very stable household that basically provided everything for him. People who knew him as a child described him as extremely intelligent, but also arrogant and socially awkward. So even though he was granted all of these privileges, he still was pretty socially awkward. Even at a young age, he really disliked criticism and believed that he was superior to everyone around him. So it kind of sounds a little narcissistic to me, but we'll have to continue talking about him to see what you guys think. Now, stories from his childhood paint a picture that is kind of unsettling in hindsight because Ishii really loved biology, but not in the innocent, ooh, I really like bugs and animals kind of way. He was known for performing dissections on animals, often without any show of empathy or regard to their suffering. So that was our already manifesting, and when we get into further detail about his later life, you'll see why that's super disturbing, but not surprising, because we've also heard that before on our podcast. So teachers would describe him as super brilliant, but his classmates described him as cold. So he didn't really make a lot of friends. Like I said, he was socially awkward. He didn't really fit in, but he didn't seem to want friends. He was okay being kind of an outcast, I guess you could call him. All he really wanted was recognition, power, and importance. So, like I said, sounded a little narcissistic, just a bit. As a teenager, Ishii's fascination with science grew into a fixation. So it turned into something more than just, this is interesting. It became something that he became slightly obsessed with, actually. He became particularly interested in bacteria, how they spread, how they behaved, and most importantly, how they killed. Yeah. So, I don't know. This is spoilers. You can kind of see where this is going, but he took interest in these things, and because of the interest that he's taking, he went to Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's most prestigious schools. There he studied microbiology and medicine. He was known for working very late into the night and for treating the laboratory animals with shocking cruelty. So that was something that people picked up on while he was in college. And other students often complained about the smell of rotting specimens coming from his dorm. Blech, that's so gross. Professors noted that he seemed almost excited by experiments involving disease. So he was, like I said, obsessed with bacteria, disease, that kind of thing. He was very driven and gifted, but really lacked a moral compass that might have actually guided him down a different path, a healthier path, a healing path. but instead his path led straight darkness. So this is where his story kind of shifts from being like this innocent, I really want to know about disease, to something more sinister. From Ishii, the promising medicine student, to Ishii, the architect of mass murder. That is the direction we are going with this. So Ishii's first quote-unquote crime wasn't actually illegal. It was just more ethically wrong. So while he worked in the universities and military labs, he began to experiment on animals in ways that were considered extreme, even for that time period. Because remember, this is back in the early 1900s, so there wasn't really any care for animals because they weren't seen as having feelings, I guess. So if people were noticing that he had these kind of extreme tests he was taking on these animals, that's saying something at this time period. Now, he actually advocated for open air pathogen testing long before he ever had any approval for it. He wanted to test those pathogens that could be transmitted throughout the air, but obviously people are kind of hesitant to approve those kinds of things. But his first true actual crime came when he began experimenting on human beings, a practice he would later expand on a massive scale. So he started doing his tests on people. So in 1921, he actually graduated from Kyoto Imperial University with a medical degree. In that same year, he commissioned as a surgeon lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. And from 1922 to 1927, he served at the First Army Hospital and later became a researcher at the Army Medical School in Tokyo. And then in 1928, he was sent abroad by the Army to study biological and chemical warfare development in Europe and the United States, a trip that heavily influenced his work later in Unit 731. Yeah. Not good. Not good. Shiro Ishii actually rose really quickly through the ranks of the Japanese Army Medical Corps. He was intelligent, and they could not deny how intelligent he was. And he was very charming with his superiors, with the promise of a revolutionary biological weapon, quote unquote. You can't see me doing that, so I need to remember to tell you I'm doing air quotes when I say revolutionary biological weapon, unquote, that could cripple entire nations. So he was schmoozing the heck out of the army, telling them, I could create a weapon for you and you would never have to set foot in the nation and it would kill all the people for you. So by the early 1930s, Ishii was given approval to create a secret biological research facility in occupied Manchuria. And this eventually would become Unit 731. But before we get into Unit 731, we need to do some historical context. And I know sometimes the historical context can be boring, but it's important because it sets the stage. Just picture it like a show. You got to set the stage, right? So in the early 1930s, Japan was building up its empire. Like I mentioned, they were building up their military. They wanted to prove themselves in the world as a national or a worldwide power. So in 1931, Japan actually invaded Manchuria, which is northeast China. If you're not sure where that is, it's east of China on a map. Just look at it. After staging the Mukden incident on September 18th, 1931. So they invaded after they did this Mukden incident. Now, what is this Mukden incident? Well, I will tell you. On September 18th, 1931, Lieutenant Tsurumori Kawamoto of the Japanese infantry detonated a small quantity of dynamite close to a railway line owned by Japan's South Manchurian Railway. The explosion was so weak that it failed to destroy any of the tracks. So they were trying to, destroy this train track so they could blame it on the Chinese people who were fighting against them. But it didn't work. It was so weak it didn't do anything to the track, and the train actually passed over it a couple minutes later. Well, that didn't stop the Imperial Japanese Army of accusing the Chinese descendants to act and invade Manchuria. So they were being sneaky. They did something, blamed it on the Chinese, and then invaded and used it as an excuse to invade. So this marked the beginning of Japan's imperial aggression. So Japan's expansion that led to World War II unfolded pretty gradually and started before the war officially began. So here's a timeline of when Japan actually began invading other countries and territories, just because we need to have this context to show, Japan was really aggressive at this point in time. So in 1931, they invaded Manchuria. 1937, they did a full-scale invasion of China. So they invaded Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, just to name a couple. And then in 1940, they invaded French in Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia now. After France fell to Germany, Japan then invaded. So they waited for France to fall before they invaded the French Indochina. And then in 1941, they invaded Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And this invasion accelerated dramatically in December of 1941. And if you know anything about World War II history, you'll know why that date is significant to us here in the United States, because it was the same month that they attacked Pearl Harbor. So they attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which was actually December 8th in Japan. So their day is December 8th. Our day here in the United States is December 7th. But within a week of that attack, they invaded the Philippines, which was a U.S. territory, Malaya and Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Dutch East Indies, Guam, and the Wake Islands. So Japan was just going crazy over there in the Pacific. And by early 1942, Japan had conquered a vast empire across East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, what at the time they called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. That is quite the mouthful. I mean, I wonder if they were planning on shortening it, but they lost, so we'll never know. So, along with their conquering, they were in the process of developing weapons. So, this is where we get back to our story. So, we needed to have that military context to explain why they were processing and developing new weapons, not only conventional weapons like, guns and rockets and those kinds of things, but they began exploring something far more insidious: biological and chemical warfare. They wanted weapons that could kill silently, invisibly, and on a mass scale. So who was the mastermind assigned to this task? Oh, you guessed it. Our one and only Dr. Shiro Ishii. So, they assigned this brilliant, morally void microbiologist to this issue. So Ishii used his charisma, ambition, and persuasion to convince Japan's military elite that the biological weapons could give them a revolutionary edge, something that could cripple entire cities or armies without a single bullet. So he had worked his magic and convincing them that he could come up with this weapon. So Ishii argued that disease has no boundaries, which in his mind made it the perfect weapon. He was given funding, manpower, and most importantly, complete secrecy. So none of the people of Japan knew that this was happening. So now we get back to Unit 731. So Unit 731 was born in Harbin, Manchuria, disguised as a water purification facility. From the very beginning, Ishii needed human test subjects, and because Manchuria was occupied territory, the Japanese military saw the local population as expendables. Yeah, so you can see where this is going. Anyone arrested, real criminals, political dissidents, I'm reading it wrong, it's not descendants, and that's what I meant before, it's dissidents. Sorry about that. I do have dyslexia, so my brain just ignored that word. Moving on. Anyways, real criminals, political dissidents, or innocent civilians could be transported to Unit 731 and erased from existence. That is why it was there. So inside the compound, these prisoners were stripped of their names and their identities. They were renamed to Maruta, which means logs. Now, I don't think it means like the stick logs that you find in a forest. I think it means logs as in I am tracking. This is my log. Like they say in, is it Star Trek? Starship log, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I don't watch that show, so I don't know why I chose that example, but I think that's why they chose that name. Because you got to dehumanize your victims. Obviously, you can't let them keep their names or else you might start feeling guilty for what you're doing to them. But Ishii and his staff only saw them as logs on a research sheet, so that's why they just called them logs. The research quickly escalated from infectious studies to torture disguised as science. This is the part of the episode where I need to warn you as listeners. You guys know me. I don't like doing anything super gruesome or gory or anything like that. But this next section is a little bit disturbing. So if you have little ears listening, you either want to pause it and listen to this later or fast forward a little bit. But the reality of this situation is pretty horrifying. So like I said, I don't go into gory detail. I want to save you guys from that kind of stuff. So, let's continue on. One of the earliest crimes that they committed was forced infection. So, what they would do is they would deliberately expose prisoners to cholera, anthrax, plague, smallpox, or literally anything, any disease that Ishii thought could become a weapon. They would intentionally expose people to these diseases. And they justified it by saying that it was quote unquote research. What was it really? Torture. You're purposely giving people diseases that will kill them. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, it gets so much worse. So, in Unit 731, they performed a staggering range of different kinds of experiments on people. Let's go through those, shall we? First, they would perform vivisection, which is the practice of performing surgery on live animals for scientific or medical research. However, they did vivisections without anesthesia on prisoners. So prisoners were dissected alive so researchers could observe disease progression in real time. That's just number one. Yeah, they did these things. This really happened. The next thing they tested was frostbite testing. Limbs were exposed to freezing temperatures, beaten until ice formed, and then thawed to study the tissue decay. Yep. So they would purposely freeze just specific body parts, beat them, and then watch as the flesh slowly rotted. Now they would do weapons testing. Grenades, flamethrowers, and chemical agents were all used on tied up victims. Dude, why? Why do you need to test a flamethrower on someone sitting there? That makes no sense to me. There's no reason. You know what burning is. If you see it shooting flames, you know it's going to hurt somebody, right? Grenades, you see it blows up, you know it's going to hurt somebody. Why do you have to test that on living people? It's just, yeah, we're only halfway through. Okay, let's keep going. Next one, forced sex slavery. Women, sometimes as young as 12. Yeah, that makes me so sick. Were raped to study how sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy outcomes would work with those diseases. Yeah, so they would purposely infect them by raping them. Yeah, this guy, he's a peach. He's a real peach. Next one, they would do pressure chamber experiments. So people would be placed inside a pressure chamber until their eyes literally ruptured or their organs ruptured. They called that organ rupture, where your organ tears or breaks, causing bleeding to surrounding areas. So, yeah, they would basically pop people. Is that the right way to phrase that? Yeah, they did that. They did dehydration experiments. So they would try and see how long people could go without water or liquid of any kind, just to see how things would go. They would do burning tests, freezing tests, which we kind of already talked about. They would do poisoning. They also did dismemberment, like removing body parts to see what would happen. Yeah, every experiment was designed to push the human body to its breaking point and then just shove it right past that. Yeah, that was the intent of all of these quote-unquote experiments. He treated human lives worse than a butcher treats livestock, basically. So, this guy is kind of the worst. Under Ishii's command, an estimated 3,000 to 12,000 prisoners were murdered inside Unit 731 alone. But that's not all, folks. We're not done yet. I know, mind blown, right? We still have a little bit more to talk about with his crimes, because his crimes extended beyond the walls of Unit 731. During his leadership of Unit 731, Ishii ordered and oversaw biological warfare field experiments on nearby Chinese villages. So not only were they torturing the people inside of Unit 731, they figured, there are villages near here. Let's use those too. So, these were not random attacks. They were deliberate tests of biological weapons meant to study how the disease spread among quote-unquote real civilian populations. And here's what we know. So, he conducted field tests in Manchuria from 1939 to 1942. Unit 731 was based in Pingfang, near Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Ishii and his team frequently conducted quote-unquote field tests using the nearby Chinese villages as live targets. So, in these tests, Japanese aircrafts or Japanese agents released plague-infected fleas, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax into villages. They also gave the villagers contaminated food, clothing, and water supplies and distributed them to unsuspecting residents. So basically coming in and saying, hey, we're here to help you. Look, we've got clothes for you. We've got food and blankets and water. Come and get these free supplies. Not knowing that they were infected with disease. And the goal was to measure infection rates, death rates, and the effectiveness of a disease as a weapon. Yeah. So this guy there were two particularly well-documented incidents that we'll talk about. So first one is Ningobo, which happened in 1940. Japanese planes dropped plague-infected fleas and grain contaminated with bubonic plague bacteria over the city. The attack triggered an epidemic that killed hundreds. Entire sections of I'm going to say it wrong. I already tried to say it. Ningobo had to be burned down by the Chinese authority to contain the disease. That's how bad it got. They literally had to burn it down to stop the disease. Now, in 1941, in Chengdi, a similar plague and cholera attack were carried out, and witnesses reported bodies piling up in the streets. And the outbreak spread far beyond the original drop zone, as, diseases do, because that's what diseases do. Now, local villages near Pingfang, there were quite a few that were surrounding Unit 731, such as Baiyanhe and others, and they were used as testing grounds. So they would infect prisoners or animals and then release them into the population to see how fast the disease would spread from that specific individual. Japanese soldiers sometimes returned later to collect samples from the corpses and charted the disease's progress. Survivors reported entire communities were wiped out, sometimes hundreds in a single outbreak. Now, what was the purpose of this? Like I said, they were not isolated atrocities. Ishii was testing methods for large-scale biological warfare. That is why he was doing this. He was testing the delivery system, what worked better, fleas, bombs, water contamination. He wanted to know what was the best option. He also wanted to test what pathogen was most effective in different weather, different terrain. So he was trying to see which disease would spread the best in what atmosphere, what conditions, and how the disease would weaken or destroy civilian morale and infrastructure. So he wasn't just seeing how well will this kill people? It was also how well will this actually destroy the civilians' ability to function? How well will the infrastructure hold up if lots of people become infected with this? So that's what he was testing. Most victims didn't survive these experiments. Those who did were often executed to prevent escape or evidence. Some were killed in mass gassings, like they did in the concentration camps in Germany. Others through poison injections, and many simply just starved or succumbed to untreated illness that they were injected with. Yeah. It's estimated that between 3,000 and 12,000 men, women, and children died inside Unit 731 alone. If we include biological attacks carried out in the surrounding villages, including the flea-infected plagues that were released from the airplanes or the contaminated water supplies and poisonings and those kinds of things, the death toll may exceed over 200,000 people. Yeah. So it was men, women, children, and infants that would become infected. No one was exempt. Ishii's focus was on results. He did not care about humanity. He saw people as objects, and even worse, he saw people as experiments. Now, the crazy thing to me is a shocking number of people actually knew about these experiments. They knew he was actually doing this to people. Senior Japanese military leaders knew about it. High-ranking government officials knew about it. Doctors and scientists from elite universities knew about it. And even some members of the imperial family knew about these tests and what was actually happening. So, Unit 731 wasn't just a rogue project of one crazy person. It was a government-sanctioned program that was supported and funded at the highest levels, which I think makes it even worse. Now, the victims in this horribleness were primarily Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, Mongolian and Russian captives, Allied POWs that included some Americans. I'm in America, so I'm going to specify that, but I'm sure there were also other Allied prisoners from, like, probably Australia, some from England. Those kinds of soldiers were probably included in those numbers of POWs. Now, Unit 731 was an equal opportunity machine of death. If you were captured, you would be used as a test subject. Now, at the end of World War II, after Japan's surrender in 1945, Ishii ordered Unit 731 destroyed. So buildings were actually blown up, documents were burned, and prisoners were executed to prevent escape or evidence. And then he vanished. He disguised himself and went into hiding with his loyal staff. He went into hiding under an assumed identity, and he hoped that the chaos of post-war Japan would protect him. But he wasn't able to stay in hiding for very long. The U.S. occupation forces knew that something was off because they heard rumors and testimonies from locals, as well as some fragments of documents actually survived. And then they actually started hearing survivor stories, and the survivors were willing to talk about what had happened to them. So eventually, Ishii was located. And trust me when I say, things didn't go the way justice demands. Let's talk about his capture, shall we? Oh, you're gonna love this. So this is where our story takes a little bit of a disturbing turn, because the horrifying truth is that while these acts were crimes against humanity, Ishii never faced legal consequences during the war. Like I said, inside Japan, he was praised, he was promoted, he was funded. He never saw himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a patriot, a scientist, and a visionary. And Japan's military leadership fully agreed with him. So Japan saw absolutely nothing wrong with what he did. Now, after the war, there was no trial either. Yep, you heard that right. Despite overwhelming evidence, the United States decided not to prosecute Ishii or most of the doctors. There was no conviction at all. Instead, Ishii struck a deal. He agreed to hand over all of his research from Unit 731. Remember, all of this is data gathered through torture and murder, in exchange for full immunity. So the US wanted his biological warfare research for the Cold War. And so Ishii walked free. Yeah, this actually happened. Shiro Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo, Japan for the rest of his life. He lived under government protection. He received a pension from the Japanese government and even gave lectures to military scientists about biological warfare. He collected a freaking government pension and lectured American military scientists? Are you freaking kidding me? He was an architect of mass murder, and they made him into an asset for the Cold War. No execution, no prison sentence, no public reckoning. He would eventually die of throat cancer in 1959 at the age of 67. No consequences for his actions at all. Meanwhile, many of the other doctors from Unit 731 went on to become medical professors, run hospitals, or hold prestigious scientific positions. Their victims, on the other hand, were forgotten for decades. Now, I have mentioned this before, but I feel like I need to say this again. I get so angry when these horrible humans that we talk about get off scot-free with their crimes. This man killed so many people. He caused so much pain to literally thousands of people. And he retired on a government pension and got to lecture like he was some brilliant, amazing man. I don't know. How about instead of making a deal with the devil, he literally tortured and killed people. How about we make him give up his research and then put him to death? How's that sound? Or, here's an idea. How about we burn the research so no one can create those horrendous biological weapons and also execute him? How's that sound? Oh, I think that's a great idea. Good job, self. You solved the problem. Ooh, this just makes me so angry. Like so angry that he faced no reckoning. I mean, I think he's facing it now. Good luck where you went, sir. Down deep. Enjoy that with the devil from Georgia. You know that song. Devil went down to Georgia. Yeah. That's where he's at. He's in Georgia. He's enjoying it down there in Georgia. Anyways, so it just makes me angry when they get off scot-free and never have to deal with the consequences. And actually, in his case, almost seemed to be praised. And he died thinking he was some kind of hero. It just makes me sick. It disgusts me. Anyways, Ishii's work left a scar that still hasn't fully healed. Entire regions of China were devastated. Thousands of family never learned what happened to their loved ones. Remember, some of these people were just criminals or just didn't agree with the government or the Japanese and were just sent there and never came home. Survivors from all of this lived with trauma and illness the rest of their lives. His research influenced global biological warfare programs, including, ironically, the very nations that once fought against Japan. So we can credit him for making biological warfare more convenient for all the countries in the world. Thanks, man. All of us don't appreciate you. So for decades, Japan denied or even downplayed Unit 731. It's only been in recent generations that there has actually been any kind of willingness to confront this specific part of their history. But Ishii's legacy lives on in memorials built by survivors, books and documentaries exposing Unit 731, and the persistent political tension between Japan and neighboring countries. There's still a lot of hostility between Japan and China because of these things. It's a legacy of pain, a lot of unanswered questions, and specifically of justice that never came, which I fully agree with. This man never ever faced justice, and it's not fair. I mean, like I said, he's facing it now, so good luck to him forever and ever. But Some myths claim that Ishii created super weapons, vaccines, or miracle treatments. None of that is true, so if you ever hear that, not true. His quote-unquote science was not groundbreaking, it was brutal. It was torture. What made his research horrifying was not innovation, it was all cruelty. His story is not one of brilliance, and no one should think he's a brilliant man. He's a freaking psychopath. It's one of unchecked power, dehumanization, and the dangers of placing ambition above morality, which is exactly what he did his whole life. So it's not surprising that when he was given the power, he totally took advantage of it and destroyed humans. So that is the story of Shiro Ishii. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you maybe not enjoyed this story, but have been educated by this story. You can't really enjoy a story like this. So I hope you learned something. And thanks again to B for this recommendation. Huge shout out. This is something a lot of people don't know about. And I think it's really important that people learn about these things from our history, so we don't repeat it. Everybody knows the saying, if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it kind of thing. So thanks again, B, for this. Huge shout out to you. And if any of you would like to request anyone that you would like to hear about, please send it my way. Like I said, you can just shoot me a message on this episode. You can even send it to me through Facebook or Instagram. I want to talk about who you guys want to hear about. Also, make sure you're sharing this, liking, subscribing, all of that fun stuff. But next week, we are going to be doing another listener request, and this one's coming from Sarah Routledge. I hope I said your last name correctly. If not, you know, I can't pronounce names. I've already made that very clear. But Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much for this next recommendation. We will be talking about the legend of Sawney Bean, which is Scotland's most infamous cannibal and the patriarch of a clan said to have murdered and eaten more than 1,000 people. Yeah, it's going to be a good story. So tune in next week as we talk about this chilling story. And again, make sure you're liking, subscribing. Thanks for joining us here on HHH, where we love talking about those horrible humans in history. We'll see you guys next week.